Thank you very much, Nikki, and thank you to CRELLA for inviting me to present at this seminar. I'm very happy to be here, and a very big hello to everybody participating. I'm going to start with an apology. You can probably hear a bird in the background. It's mating season for the Asian coals, so they are very active and very noisy. I've tried recording this presentation all day, trying to dodge the calls, but it really hasn't worked. So I'm afraid I'm just going to go with it and hope that you can still hear me. Okay, I'd like to start with a little information about me to set this presentation in context. I work on a consultancy basis with the Assessment Research Group in the British Council, and it is through my work with the Assessment Research Group that this study has been conceived. I'm also doing a part-time PhD with CRELLA. I'm 15 months in and I'm just about to start data collection, so that's very exciting, I think. And today I'd like to present some of my plans, invite questions, and I welcome any and all feedback. So my area of interest is language assessment literacy, and I'm interested in this for two reasons. Firstly, when I joined the Assessment Research Group in 2013, I had an administrative role supporting the Assessment Research Awards and Grants. I had no background in testing and assessment. However, looking back, it does occur to me that if I did have some knowledge of the concepts of testing and assessment, or some idea of the underpinning theories, I think I would have been able to do my job better. So since then, it's been playing on my mind. And the second reason really is my background is in teaching, and when I first started reading about Lao, everything that I read was either for teachers or about teachers, and I loved it. I found it really interesting, and that generated an interest in me to find out more about it. There are many definitions of language assessment literacy in the literature. My particular favourite is this one, partly because it's succinct, partly because it's all-encompassing at the same time. I like the way that it talks about Lao being contextualized. I think that's really important. I like the idea of a repertoire of competencies, a collection of knowledge, skills and expertise that individuals, depending on their needs and depending on their context, can use to suit their own purposes. And I like the fact that it's very, very inclusive. It, by talking about understanding, evaluating, in some cases creating and analysing, I think it speaks to many, many stakeholders. And that's why I like that definition. So moving on to the literature, there is an awful lot of literature about language assessment literacy. I am not going to talk about it in detail, and I have just on this slide got a very few studies. The reason that I've cited these particular studies is because as I was beginning my literature review, these are the papers and studies that push my thinking along, that helped me to think about my research design, made me think about what language assessment literacy might mean for stakeholders who don't have a background in it, that have had no kind of formal training or education in it. So initially, literature around language assessment literacy was on teachers, and I think the work on teachers provided a solid foundation for further work into Lao for other stakeholders. So as I said, these are just a selection of the studies. I haven't mentioned them all, but there's been work done around policymakers, there's been work done around university employees, mostly admissions employees, but not exclusively. And there's been some work around other stakeholders that fall outside of these categories. Linda Taylor has developed the profiles LAL profiles for stakeholders, and they have been an incredibly useful springboard for other researchers to further the thinking and work around LAL for other stakeholders. Benjamin Kreml and Luke Harding, for their language assessment literacy survey, they used Linda Taylor's profiles as a starting point to develop the categories in their survey. And that survey is incredibly thorough and extensive. And from what I understand, the survey is for anyone who engages or interacts with language testing and assessment. That said, I do think there is a gap. I think there's a gap for looking into the LAL needs of employees within a single organisation that engages in a variety of testing and assessment activities. So with that in mind, my two research questions are: what are the function-specific language assessment literacy needs, language assessment needs of employees in British Council, and how are they shared across different functions? And what are the features and assessment development framework for specific functions? So my research site is the British Council. I'm looking into the needs of employees within specific function areas. So what do I mean by employees and what do I mean by function specific? In order to explain that, I'm going to have to tell you a little bit about the British Council and how it works. So the British Council is a global organisation. Its work is across 7 regions. MENA in the centre stands for Middle East and North Africa. And across those 7 regions, the work is divided into 3 strategic business units: English and exams, education and society, and arts. So English is about the work that we do through our teaching centre network, so teaching English to young learners, to adults, to businessmen, providing exams preparation courses, etc. Our work in exams is very diverse. It ranges from test development, research and dissemination, distribution, delivery, administration. Our work in education and society is also diverse, ranging from supporting higher education, to employability, to looking at governance and civil rights, thinking about work around women and girls particularly. But within education, we also work with ministries of education on education reform. And arts is pretty self-explanatory. So if we think, and I've explained that quite briefly, about 3 strategic business units and them being implemented across the 7 regions, that's an incredible amount of work that happens. And in order for that work to happen continuously and consistently, there needs to be support mechanisms. And these are the function areas that I mentioned in my research questions. So function areas are the support mechanisms that make strategy happen, really. They support the work that's done on the ground, and function areas work in very different ways. But before I go on, just to say that these function areas that you can see on the slide, they are not specific to the British Council. These are generic. So if you Google function areas and organisations, you're going to get a combination or some or all of these, depending on the kind of organisation that you're looking at. The reason these are not specific to the British Council is because I haven't yet decided which function areas I will focus on. But if you look at the areas, they should be all familiar to you, whether you work in a university, an organisation. But I suppose the next question is, well, hold on a minute, how do these function areas engage with language testing and assessment? What do employers within these function areas actually do? So I'm going to give you a few examples just to illustrate the kind of work that happens. So in operations, employees are involved in test administration and delivery. So British Council delivers the IELTS test, the APTIS test. We're involved in exams distribution for UK examination bodies. We do deliver professional exams. So a lot of work around operations there. In marketing, mainly promotion of testing services. So promotion through various channels, through written material, face-to-face events, social media, and marketing also have a say in the dissemination agenda, what is disseminated into the public domain and what is less so. Human resources engage with language testing and assessment in basically knowing and identifying exactly the work that employees in different areas are involved in, so that they can then take that information and develop relevant and appropriate development programs for employees. Customer service, they're on the front line. They answer initial queries about tests and assessment. The queries can come from test takers, parents of test takers. They can come from awarding bodies, ministries of education, external organisations, absolutely anybody who might be interested in testing and assessment. And the queries could be to do with anything, could be to do with about scores or processes or anything really. And leadership is quite a big function. Best for me to give you a couple of examples then. So one of our leadership functions is country director. So directors who sit in a particular country and manage that office. And they're in constant contact with decision makers, high level influencers who want to know about the British Council, and country directors need to know about all of our services, and that includes testing and assessment. They can't obviously know everything, but they need to know enough to manage a conversation with these high-level people. Another role in leadership is business development manager. Their main purpose is to generate business, and this involves talking to clients, advising clients, telling clients about the services and the products we have. So a whole range of work around testing and assessment that happens in these different function areas. And it's probably obvious to you as I'm talking through it, but very often this is behind the scenes work that we sometimes don't hear about. Okay, so why am I interested in these employees that sit in these function areas? Because they are important stakeholders in the organisation's testing and assessment ecosystem. They are part of the testing and assessment chain. They are one of the links. So they are really important. And if I think back to Keynes' chain, he says that the chain is only as strong as the weakest link. Yeah. So if one of those links is weak or gets broken, then the whole system doesn't work. The ILTA Code of Ethics, Principle 7. So language testers shall be prepared by virtue of their knowledge and experience to advise those responsible for the provision of language services. So we have I think, a responsibility to support those who are providing language testing services. British Council provides these services and therefore has a responsibility to ensure that the people who fulfill these functions have the appropriate and relevant knowledge and skills in order for them to do their jobs effectively. Because their actions and decisions have consequences for customers, clients, and the organisation. So if these employees in the function areas, they don't have the right knowledge, the right skills, the right information, they could provide inaccurate, incorrect information to customers and clients. They could miscommunicate information about test scores, for example, and that could have negative consequences, not only for the customers and clients, but also for the organisation. And I think that's a pretty good reason to be looking into the LAL needs of these particular stakeholders to avoid negative consequences. Because those groups of stakeholders, their needs, as far as skills and knowledge in the area of language testing and assessment, have been under-researched, I think. I think they've been a neglected area, and not neglected intentionally, but they've just been under-researched and underrepresented in the literature. Okay, so onto my design. So my research design is a mixed method study. It has 4 phases, and you'll see that 3 of them are qualitative and 1 of them is quantitative. And a little bit more detail about that. So phase 1 involves document gathering and analysis, and the purpose of this really is to get the organisation's perspective on language assessment literacy. Is it important? And if so, how is it reflected in strategy and development? And also to get the organisation's perspective on learning and development as a whole, and where language assessment literacy might sit within that. The findings of phase 1, they feed into phase 2. Phase 2 involves interviews and focus groups, and the purpose of these are to get individual perspectives, so perspectives from employees on the ground in those different function areas, across those different regions. Phase 3, and the findings for phase 2 will feed into the development of an online survey in phase 3. And the purpose of the survey is to see if the findings from phase 2 are generalizable across a larger population of the organisation. And finally, in phase 4, we have member checking with a small group of employees to verify my interpretations and findings. I'm not going to go into each phase in detail. What I'd like to do instead is to focus on the grounded theory, because this is the analysis I'm using for the first 2 phases, and it is by far the aspect of my research design that I have get the most questions on. So what is grounded theory? I'll let you just read that for a second. So grounded theory for me is a set of excuse me, methods and processes that enable data collection, data analysis, coding, comparison. So it's very structured and systematic, but at the same time, from what I've read about it, it's very fluid and very organic as well. But it is a set of procedures that takes you through collection and analysis of qualitative data. So why am I using grounded theory? Back to the ILTA Code of Ethics and the second annotation of Principle 7. So one of the things I notice, and one of the things that Beverly Baker feels very strongly about, is that so far in our field, looking at other stakeholders, the approach seems to have been quite top-down, as in we think we know what other stakeholders need or what might be useful for them. And this annotation from the ILTA Code of Ethics says that that we do not claim that we possess all the relevant knowledge. So we don't know everything. And I really am taking that quite literally in my study. So one of the premises of grounded theory is openness, remaining open to whatever the data shows you and wherever it takes you. So going in with no preconceived ideas. Now, obviously, I will need to go in with very broad areas initially to even start beginning the data gathering documents. But the idea is I have no preconceived ideas of themes or what I think I might find, but to remain open. The other reason I'm using grounded theory is collaboration. So part of grounded theory is co-construction of context, realities, and theory itself. So the idea that the researcher works with the participants to construct together the context that the participant resides in, their reality of the situation, and finally the theory that emerges from this information. And I particularly like the idea of collaboration because from my literature review, some of the most enlightening findings came from studies where researchers had collaborated with participants either through interviews or focus groups or workshops to build on possibly quantitative data that they had collected, but really to build a connection and find out from the participants themselves what their reality was in terms of language assessment and testing. I thought it might be a good idea just to compare grounded theory and thematic analysis, because the second most common question I get is, why aren't you using thematic analysis? And I think I've just explained that, but just to go through this table. So with grounded theory, to generate theory, the idea is to generate theory from data. So the data is all important and the theory must come from there. With thematic analysis, the purpose is to analyse the data to ascertain pre-existing theory or hypothesis. So you may have themes in mind or categories in mind, and the idea is to look at the data and see whether the themes or the categories work or not. There are similarities in the approaches. So there are various iterations of both grounded theory and thematic analysis. There isn't just one way to do them. There are different ways to do them depending on the school of thought you wish to follow. Excuse me. So both approaches are very active. Theory and themes are generated. They don't just magically appear or emerge from the data. It takes hard work. It takes very close interaction with the data in order to generate those theories and themes, and that is true of both approaches. And both approaches use coding in different ways and different types, but they both use coding. The difference is, so with grounded theory, data collection and analysis happen right from the beginning. So with my study, I envisage gathering a few documents, but as soon as I've got the first few, to start looking at them, analysing them, see if I can code anything. With thematic analysis, analysis starts once all the data has been collected. So you've got all your interview transcripts, or you've got all your documents, and then you start your analysis. With grounded theory, the process is purely inductive. It's ground up, it comes from the data. With thematic analysis, it can be inductive or deductive. With grounded theory, the literature review is quite a point of discussion. In classic grounded theory, which originated in the 1960s, the literature review, it was advised to do that right at the end, because if you did it at the beginning, you might come to your data with preconceived ideas. However, now it's thought that once you've got your categories, you would do your literature review that would then add value and validation to your categories in the context that you're working in. With thematic analysis, the literature review usually happens at the beginning. But there's a practical element there as well. I mean, if you want to undertake formal research, then you have to write a proposal, and most proposals ask for a literature review. So there is that practical element there. So grounded theory methods, what do they actually involve? So as you can see from this diagram, it's a very fluid process, but within that fluidity, there is structure and there's a lot of work that goes on. So it starts off with purposive sampling, initial coding, soon goes into data collection, generation, soon goes into theoretical sampling. So the idea that your next data, you look for your data based on information that comes out of the previous analysis. So it feeds in to the data gathering and the analysis. And then we go into constant comparative analysis. So looking backwards, once you've generated some codes or you have some loose themes, you go back to your data and say, hold on a minute, is this true for the data initially as well? Constantly comparing it, identifying categories. While all this is going on, you're writing memos. Memoing is incredibly important in grounded theory. It basically makes the whole process transparent, because what you're doing is you're recording your decisions that you take, thought processes, questions that you might ask, aha moments. So memos are basically an audit trail of your research process. And they are incredibly, incredibly important. And a memo can be anything from a couple of words, a question, to a paragraph. And researchers are encouraged to start memoing right at the beginning of the process. So we have initial coding, there is intermediate coding, sometimes called axial coding, and the process goes on. So as you can see, it is incredibly organic, it's incredibly involved, quite rigorous, and possibly even messy. And that, I think that's okay sometimes. But in terms of how does this fit in with my whole mixed methods research design? So as I've already said, the findings from the different phases feed into subsequent phases. But I think I will also find that I'm going to have to go back, especially when I do my survey and I'll get my quantitative data. I'll want to triangulate that with the qualitative data I found. But even with the member checking, that may involve going back. Certainly with phases 1 and 2, there'll be a lot of backwards and forwards, to and froing happening. So as I said, fluid, messy, organic, but at the same time very exciting. And I think that's me done. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for listening. And I have a few references there. And thank you.